Ever felt someone was a little too charming or suspected someone was using subtle tactics to sway you? In today's episode, we're diving into the timeless psychology of power and deception, guided by Machiavelli's The Prince, and how it still applies to our everyday lives. This episode is a collaboration of expert insights, and the voice you're hearing represents our team's unified perspective.
All right, let's dive into some psychology today. Power, deception, the fun stuff. We're using Machiavelli's The Prince as a starting point. But don't worry, this isn't just for folks who want to rule a country.
Right.
We're going to bring in modern psychology, too, and see how this stuff, this, centuries-old playbook, still works. Like at work, in relationships, even just trying to get the best parking spot.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Machiavelli was writing about rulers and princes, but the core ideas, they're surprisingly relevant to anyone. I mean, we all deal with influence and persuasion every day, right?
Totally. And that's what's so cool about this deep dive. I mean, we're talking about Machiavellianism here. A word that's, well, it's often used as a way to just say someone's bad or manipulative.
Yeah.
But is it always that simple? Like, how many times have we heard that phrase, the ends justify the means?
Good question.
Does that actually hold up?
That is a great question, and it gets right to the core of the ethical debate around Machiavelli. But here's something interesting. Machiavellianism, it's actually considered one of 3 personality traits that make up what psychologists call the Dark Triad.
Dark Triad. Ooh, okay, now that sounds a little ominous. Like we're getting into thriller territory here.
Right.
So break it down for us. What are these 3 traits?
Okay, so the Dark Triad, it's Machiavellianism, narcissism, and then psychopathy. And while they're all distinct things, they do tend to show up together. And they're often linked to people being kind of ruthless in how they get what they want. For example, think of a character like Gordon Gekko from Wall Street.
Ah, okay, I get you. But you said Machiavellianism. It's different from the other 2, right?
Yeah, exactly. What sets it apart is that focus on strategy, on thinking long-term, on subtle manipulation. Less about impulsiveness, more about carefully planning your moves and kind of nudging situations to get the outcome you want. It's almost like a master chess player, always thinking many steps ahead.
So it's more about outsmarting your opponent than just overpowering them.
Exactly.
Well, that makes sense. And, it makes you wonder, haven't we all met someone like this in our lives, that coworker who just always seems to get their way, or a friend who's like surprisingly good at getting you to do things their way?
Yeah, it's definitely something to think about. But to bring this all into the 21st century, there's this great book by Robert Cialdini called Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion. It's like a modern exploration of all the ways we get influenced, often without even realizing it. And the crazy thing is, Machiavelli, back in the 1500s, he was already using some of these tactics.
Wait, so you're saying Machiavelli was like a persuasion pioneer? Tell me more. This is fascinating.
Well, for example, one of Cialdini's 6 key principles is called liking. Basically, his research showed that we're way more likely to be swayed by people we actually like and trust. And guess what? Machiavelli advised rulers to do just that. Appear trustworthy and moral, even if they weren't, to win over their followers.
Wow, that's pretty sneaky. But I got to admit, it makes sense, right? I mean, think about marketing today. Think about dating apps.
Oh, yeah.
It's all about how you present yourself, how you influence people. We're bombarded with messages trying to make us like something or like someone.
Absolutely.
Machiavelli, he was way ahead of his time. He knew the power of perception.
That's right.
And that takes us to another key thing in his thinking. This idea of appearing virtuous. It's not enough to just be good. You got to be seen as good, according to him.
Right.
And that, my friends, that leads us into the world of deception, which I'm sure we'll be talking about a lot more in just a bit. This is getting good. Okay, so we've talked about Machiavellian appearances. Like, especially when it comes to seeming virtuous, it's almost like fake it till you make it, but on a much bigger scale, like with empires and stuff.
Yeah, he totally got it. He knew that power, a lot of it is about what people believe, not just actual strength.
Right, right.
And this is where things get really interesting, because now we're talking about deception.
Ooh, deception. Sounds like a spy movie. But seriously, how good are we, like regular people, at spotting a liar? I mean, I like to think I can read people pretty well.
Well, we all like to think we're good at that.
Right.
But research shows that most of us, we're barely better than chance at figuring out if someone's lying. Turns out our gut feeling isn't always so reliable.
Really? So all that time watching, like, crime shows and thinking I could be a human lie detector was for nothing. What are we missing then? Like, what are the signs someone's not telling the truth?
Okay, this is where it gets cool. There's this whole field of study on what are called micro-expressions.
Uh-huh.
Tiny, super quick facial movements that can flash across your face like for a split second. They reveal your true emotions, even if you're trying to hide them.
Microexpressions. Yeah, I've heard of those. But aren't they almost impossible to see?
They are fleeting, like a fraction of a second. But with training, you can learn to recognize them. These researchers, Ekman and Friesen, they even made a whole system for like coding and analyzing these micro-expressions. It's like a secret language of the face.
So there's like this whole hidden conversation happening on people's faces all the time. And this connects back to Machiavelli somehow.
Absolutely. He might not have known the science of micro-expressions, but he got the big idea. Control your emotions, mask your true intentions. He was advocating for what we now call emotional intelligence way back then.
So like, be a good actor if you want to be a good leader, basically.
Kinda, yeah. It shows how forward-thinking he was. But then the question is, if we can learn to spot these tiny facial expressions, can't those who are, like, really good at deception learn to control them even better? It's like a cat and mouse game.
That's a good point. So if we can't always trust what people say or even their faces, how do we protect ourselves from being manipulated, I mean?
It takes critical thinking, for sure, and a healthy dose of skepticism. Gotta be aware that deception, it's a possibility, always, especially when there's, like, a power imbalance.
Right.
Don't just take everything at face value. Look for times when someone's words don't match what they do. Trust your gut, too, but don't be afraid to ask questions. A lot of questions.
So trust your gut, but verify, like that old saying.
Exactly. And this takes us to another big theme for Machiavelli, fear. Using it to control people. He had that famous line, "It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both."
Yeah, that one's a classic Machiavelli quote. A little intense, don't you think?
It is, but it makes you think, does using fear always work? Or are there times when it backfires?
Right, right.
Well, there's actually some psychology research on this. In situations where you need people to obey immediately, like a military thing or a crisis, fear can be really motivating.
So in those high-pressure moments, a leader who makes people a little afraid might actually be more effective. Getting things done fast, I mean.
Exactly. But there is a catch. This study by Kipnis, Schmidt, and Wilkinson, they found that while fear might work short-term, long-term, it leads to bad stuff. Resentment, people not trusting the leader, eventually it weakens their authority.
Like that saying, you can catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. People will do what you say if they're scared, but they won't be loyal.
Exactly. And Machiavelli himself even said that just relying on fear, it wasn't enough to inspire real loyalty.
So then what's the alternative? If fear's not always the answer, how else do you lead people?
Well, one thing that's been studied a lot is something called transformational leadership. This is about inspiring people, not scaring them, creating a shared vision, helping folks reach their potential. It's about relationships, trust, building a positive environment, making people feel valued.
That sounds so much better than ruling through fear, like actually sustainable.
It is, and research shows that it works. People are more engaged, more productive. Leaders are seen as more trustworthy. It's a win-win.
Okay, but let me play devil's advocate here. Are there ever times when using fear is justified? Like, what if a leader has to make a tough decision? One that people won't like, but it's the right thing to do?
That's a great question. It really gets at the tough ethics of leadership. There are absolutely times when a leader has to make hard choices, even if they're unpopular. But you got to do it with integrity. Be transparent. Explain why you're making that decision, even if folks don't like it.
So it's not about being scary just for the sake of it. It's about being clear and decisive, even when it's hard.
Exactly. Real leadership isn't about controlling people. It's about empowering them.
This is also interesting. It makes you rethink those old ideas about power, like the ones we've all kind of accepted.
It does, and it shows how important critical thinking is, and ethical decision-making, both in our personal lives and in, society as a whole.
For sure. So we've talked about deception, microexpressions, how fear can be a tool. What other Machiavellian tactics should we watch out for?
Well, there's one that's super relevant in today's world. With social media, all these carefully crafted images we see online. Flattery. Ingratiation.
Flattery, huh? Who doesn't like a good compliment? But how can something that seems so innocent be manipulative?
That's the thing. It's sneaky. Flattery works because we all want to be liked, we want to be appreciated, When someone's praising us, we tend to let our guard down, and then we're easier to influence.
So it's like buttering someone up before you ask for a favor.
Exactly. And what makes it tricky is it can be hard to tell if it's sincere, especially when it's done well.
Right, right. So how can we spot the difference? Genuine compliment versus someone trying to play us.
Look at the context. Look at how that person usually acts. Are they always super flattering? Do their compliments feel specific and real, or are they kind of vague? Do their actions match their words?
Well, we got to be like amateur detectives, always analyzing everyone.
Well, in a way, yeah. But it's not about being paranoid. It's about being aware, being smart, trusting your instincts. Watch for red flags, anything that doesn't add up.
Okay, let's say we do spot a master manipulator. What's the best way to deal with that? Do you confront them, ignore them, try to, out-manipulate them?
There's no one right answer. It all depends on the situation and your relationship with that person.
Right. Makes sense. Dealing with your boss is way different from dealing with, some random person you met.
Exactly. And the stakes are different too, obviously. But generally, the most important thing is to set boundaries. Protect yourself.
So learning to say no is key.
Absolutely. And being ready to walk away from anything that's toxic or harmful, even if it's hard.
Which is easier said than done, right? Especially if someone's really good at pushing your buttons.
It can be tough. It takes self-awareness, learning to be assertive. Sometimes even therapy can help. Or books, workshops, anything that teaches you healthy communication and how to set boundaries.
So to navigate this world of power and deception, you need knowledge and some good strategies.
You got it.
Mm-hmm.
The more we understand these tactics, the better we can protect ourselves and make choices that are, more ethical, more conscious.
Okay, we've covered a lot today. Deception, micro-expressions, the whole thing about flattery, and when fear is a good or bad tactic. It's been quite the journey.
It has. But before we wrap up this part, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. While Machiavelli's work can feel, kind of dark, there's a lesson in it, even if we don't use his methods ourselves.
Interesting. What's that?
By understanding this darker side of human nature, we can appreciate the good stuff more. Integrity, empathy, ethical leadership. Machiavelli's work, it reminds us that power can be really tempting. It can corrupt. And it's up to each of us to use it responsibly.
That's a good point. It's like a call to action, to be more aware of ourselves and try to create a world where power is used for good, not just for personal gain.
Exactly. That's something worth fighting for.
All right, everyone, that's it for part 2 of our deep dive into all things Machiavellian. Join us for part 3, where we'll really get into the ethics of these tactics, and we'll talk about some real-world strategies for resisting manipulation. Until then, stay curious, stay vigilant, and stay empowered. Welcome back, everyone, for the final part of our Machiavellian deep dive.
We've been through a lot, haven't we? The psychology of deception, how these strategies work in real life, and now it's time to tackle the big one.
Yeah, the elephant in the room. We've seen that these tactics can be effective.
Right.
But the question is, are they ethical?
Yeah.
That's what we're going to try to figure out today.
It's a tricky subject, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, Machiavelli's ideas about power, human nature, they're valuable, insightful even.
Right.
But his whole philosophy, it seems to put results above everything else.
Yeah, it's that ends justify the means thing that makes it also morally gray. Who gets to decide what a good outcome is anyway? And at what cost?
That's the core of the ethical dilemma, right? If any action is okay, as long as you get what you want, where do you draw the line?
Exactly.
And it's important to remember, Machiavelli was writing in a very different time. 16th century Italy, tons of political chaos.
So maybe what was acceptable back then, it's not so acceptable now, by today's standards, I mean.
Exactly. Our ideas about right and wrong, they've changed. What might have been normal for Machiavelli's world just doesn't fly today.
Okay, so let's fast forward to the 21st century. How do Machiavellian tactics show up in our world? And is there ever a case where they're actually ethically okay?
I think the key here is understanding that there are levels to Machiavellianism. It's not like all or nothing.
So there's a spectrum.
Yeah, totally. On one side, you have what you could call everyday Machiavellianism. The little tactics we all use to get our way, sometimes without even thinking about it.
Like negotiating a lower price.
Yeah.
Or trying to impress someone on a first date. We've all been there.
Exactly. That stuff, while maybe not always admirable, it's generally seen as, within the bounds of normal behavior.
We all want to look good.
Right.
Sometimes that takes a little strategizing.
Right. But then on the other side of the spectrum, there's toxic Machiavellianism, the kind of stuff that's intentionally hurtful, meant to exploit people.
Like gaslighting your partner to control them. or sabotaging a colleague to get ahead. Actions that can really hurt people.
Exactly. That stuff crosses a line, ethically speaking. But the toughest part is that middle ground, where your own self-interest, it bumps up against potentially harming someone else. That's the hardest to figure out.
So how do we even know where that line is?
Yeah.
When does being strategic become something that's actually wrong, morally wrong?
It often comes down to two things: your intent and the impact of your actions. If you're trying to manipulate someone just to benefit yourself, no matter how it affects them, that's definitely unethical. But even if you have good intentions, if your actions end up hurting someone, well, you still got to own up to that.
It's like walking a tightrope. You're trying to balance your own needs with the impact you have on others.
Yeah, exactly. And it takes a lot of self-awareness, critical thinking, empathy. That's why understanding these tactics is so important. Even if you choose to never use them, it helps you see when someone's using them on you.
So let's say you do find yourself in that situation. Someone's trying to manipulate you, or, you're tempted to use these tactics yourself. What advice would you give?
The first thing is trust your gut. If something feels off, don't ignore that. It's usually trying to tell you something.
Like when someone's being super charming, but something about it feels fake. Their actions don't match their words.
Exactly. Pay attention to those little things. Don't be afraid to ask questions, to push back, and set boundaries to protect yourself.
So being assertive, standing up for yourself, that's key.
Totally. Don't be a pushover. You have a right to say no, to look out for yourself, and to walk away from any situation that feels bad or unhealthy.
Which, again, is way easier said than done, right? Especially when you're dealing with someone who's good at pushing your buttons.
It can be really tough, and it often means working on yourself. Learning to be more assertive. Therapy can help with that, or books, workshops, anything that teaches healthy communication skills and how to set good boundaries.
It sounds like navigating all this power and deception, it takes knowledge and the right tools.
It does. And the more we know about these tactics, the better we can protect ourselves. Make good choices, ethical choices. But it's not just about defense.
Right. We also have to be honest with ourselves. Like, are we ever tempted to use these Machiavellian tactics?
Absolutely. And here's the thing to remember. While Machiavellian tactics, they might seem like they work in the short term, they can actually make you pretty lonely in the long run. You might get what you want, but you lose out on real connection, on actually feeling fulfilled.
So it's like winning the battle, but losing the war.
Exactly. And more research is showing that leadership that's based on being real, on genuine connection, that's actually more effective, more sustainable.
So I guess the big takeaway from Machiavelli, even if you don't agree with everything he said, is that power is a double-edged sword.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Power can be used for good or for bad. And that choice, it's up to each of us. Do we use it to manipulate people or to help them, to lift them up?
That's a really powerful message. It's like a challenge to be more mindful of how we use our influence, to be more ethical, more compassionate.
Exactly. If we understand all of this, maybe we can actually create a world where power is used the right way, for good, not for selfish reasons.
And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into Machiavellian tactics. We've covered a lot: the psychology of deception, the ethical questions, how to navigate this whole tricky world.
We hope you found this deep dive useful. Remember, knowledge is power. Stay curious, stay vigilant, and stay empowered.
Thanks for joining us in this deep dive into the art of influence and control. Machiavelli's ideas remind us that while power can be tempting, using it responsibly is the true challenge. If you enjoyed these insights, subscribe to Cognitive Curves for more episodes that explore the complexities of human behavior and relationships. Don't forget to drop a comment. Let's hear your thoughts on Machiavellian tactics in modern life.